there is one more piece of information we need, and that relates to, helps us interpret the results in the patient sample where we obtained very long clotting times. 140 seconds, 141, 142, very similar clotting times in 3 different dilutions. So what we need to know is, what would be the clotting time of this assay system if we didn't add any factor VIII? That's an important piece of information. And how do we obtain that information? We start with the same factor VIII deficient plasma, 100 microlitres. Just a single tube. And remember, for all the previous tests, we made 3 dilutions of test, standard, QC. And we added that to the 0% factor VIII, the factor VIII deficient plasma. To look at the clotting time for this assay system in the absence of any added factor VIII, we simply add the dilution buffer now to the factor VIII deficient plasma. So I need the same buffer we've been using to construct dilutions, and this is added to the factor VIII deficient plasma, 100 microlitres. So it's in place of the dilution. No factor VIII in the buffer, of course. So there's just deficient plasma and buffer. This is warmed, and then we treat it in the same way as we did the dilutions of test, standard, QC, and so on. Coming up to temperature. Incubated for 3 minutes. So we've got the factor VIII deficient plasma. Contains contact factors, other clotting factors, but completely lacks factor VIII. We know that it clots for the reasons we've already discussed. We'll obtain a clotting time for a sample which completely lacks factor VIII. So just here we want to know what will be that clotting time in the absence of any added factor VIII. And when we get that piece of information, we can use that to assist interpretation of the clotting times from patient mixtures. Any patient mixtures with clotting times very similar to this clotting time for buffer alone, sometimes called blank time, sometimes called buffer time. Any patient mixtures with clotting times similar to this don't have sufficient factor VIII in to have any impact on the dose-response curve. And if the clotting times are similar, they almost certainly contain a very similar level of factor VIII to the buffer. In other words, no factor VIII. So it's a really useful piece of information that allows us to say any clotting times around this, such a patient sample is probably lacking any factor VIII. We need the graph paper and the plot to really draw a safe conclusion on that, because of course we made some dilution of patient samples. But of course we often have some information in advance of beginning the factor VIII assay. We often have some information about the anticipated levels of factor VIII. We may have past results on the same patient. We may know this is a family with severe haemophilia. This is a patient with severe haemophilia without recent treatment. So we often have some indication in advance of what we might expect. And if we anticipate a very low level of factor VIII, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, less than 1 international units per deciliter, so moderate or severe haemophilia, if we anticipate that before we start the assay, we can take that into account. We should take that into account before we construct the dilutions. And if here there's 2 things we can do, 2 things we should do. The calibration curve that we've generated so far, 1 in 10, 1 in 20, 1 in 40. The first thing we can do is extend that calibration curve, include some additional dilutions, 1 in 80, 1 in 160. Of course, with significantly lower levels of factor VIII, taking the concentration in those dilutions down lower towards the level that might be expected in the patient sample. So that's one action we can perform. The second is we can modify the dilutions of patient sample. So instead of 1 in 10, 20, 40, we might choose instead, where we expect a very low level, 1 in 5, 1 in 10, 1 in 20. 3 minutes. Calcium to this buffer blank tube. If we anticipate a rather high level of factor VIII, again we may have some clue about that before we undertake the assay, perhaps a mild von Willebrand's patient who's been treated with DDAVP, maybe a mild hemophiliac who's been treated with DDAVP. Perhaps we've got an APTT that's particularly short. If we do still want to make an accurate factor VIII concentration assay in such a patient, we can also take that into account when we construct our patient dilutions. So if we anticipate a rather high level, or perhaps we've done the factor VIII assay that indicates a high level, if we need an accurate answer, and we may do, then we should make higher dilutions. So we might test such a sample instead of one in 10, 20, 40, we might do one in 20, 40, 80. We might do one in 40, 80, 160, for example. So the aim would be to produce, where possible, clotting times on the test and QC materials, clotting times which sit, where possible, within the range covered by the standard. And those of you who are running factor VIII assays on commercial large autoanalyzers, you will, I imagine, many of you will use additional concentrations, additional dilutions to construct the standard curve. And sometimes it's necessary to produce different calibration curves to deal with samples with particularly low levels, for example. On other systems, it is possible to use a single curve that's suitable for all the expected levels. So we have some discussion about that in the WFH laboratory manual. We have a section in there related to automation. And again, I have some comments on that in the section on factor VIII assays, and I would refer you to that. So remember, this is deficient plasma, simply with buffer added, followed by APTT reagent and calcium. And we're looking for a clotting time. Aha. And we have a clot. It's a particularly prolonged clotting time, well, 142 seconds. And when it's particularly prolonged, as in this case, the clot is rather weak. It's rather wispy. And that can sometimes cause problems on autoanalyzers, but I think with experience it's possible to recognise that this is indeed a clot during the manual method. So 142 seconds. Now, and if you remember, that's very similar, almost identical to the times we obtained in one of the patients at different dilutions. So those clotting times are very similar to the blank time. Indication being that there is very, very low level, probably no factor VIII present in that patient sample. Once we've obtained the clotting times in the factor VIII assay, we need to make some decisions about the data before we can even move to the plotting process. The most important question relates to the clotting times we've obtained with the standard calibration reference plasma. Remember that we did this at the beginning and again at the end of the assay, so that all of the patient and IQC data were generated in between, sandwiched between those two sets of calibration plasma data. So we need to look at the clotting times we obtained. For the 1 in 10 dilution, at the beginning of the assay, 63 seconds. When we repeated the standard at the end of the assay, 1 in 10 dilution, 64 seconds. Not identical, that's typical, but a very similar result, an acceptable variability, the same answer. For the 1 in 20 dilution, beginning of the assay, 69 seconds. End of the assay, 70 seconds. Once again, very similar, acceptable variation. The 1 in 40 dilution at the beginning of the assay, 85 seconds. For the calibration curve we ran at the end of the assay, the 1 in 40 dilution, 78.5. So that's quite different, 7 seconds. That's a bigger difference, almost 10%. Normally we would expect the clotting times to be within 5%. So that's quite a difference. So at this point, it's possible that one of those includes some error, some imprecision, and we'll be able to reach a judgment on that when we take those clotting times onto the graph paper, which is the next step. The graph paper we're using just now for the calculation for the one-stage factor VIII, this is double logarithmic. It's acceptable to use log linear paper. This also normally gives a straight line relationship for the calibration curve. So either can be used. We're using log just now. We noticed for the reagents that we've been using for this demonstration, this normally gives a better line using this graph paper. So we're working on double logarithmic scale. We plot the concentration of factor VIII along the x-axis, the clotting time in seconds on the y-axis. If we decide the first one is 10 seconds, these become 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90, 100 seconds, 200, 300, 400. So 10 seconds, 100 seconds, 200 seconds. Plotting time. Concentration. This we will derive from the dilutions. Whichever is the first dilution, in this case 1 in 10. Perhaps with another reagent set it might be 1 in 5. With even a different reagent set it might be 1 in 20. On this occasion the first dilution 1 in 10. For the purposes of plotting, it's conventional to take the first dilution, in this case 1 in 10, and use that as a 100% for the purposes of plotting. Logarithmic scale. If this is 100%, 90, 80, 70, 60, 50, 40, 30, 20, 10%, 9, 8, 7, 1% for the purposes of plotting. First dilution, 1 in 10, which we're considering 100% for the purposes of plotting. So the clotting times we obtain for the 1 in 10 are on this location. Which was the clotting time for the standard 1 in 10 dilution? 63 seconds, 64 seconds. Very close, so we should take an average, 63.5 seconds. So we need to locate on the vertical axis, where is 63.5 seconds? 10 seconds, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70. It sits here between 60 and 70, very close to the 64 point on this axis. It's a very narrow scale, and this is a problem with manual calculations in this way. We can introduce some variability. If several people take the same clotting times to the graph paper, there is some variability in the way the figures are interpreted. So we have to keep that in mind as a source of variability. 63.5. Now we need the clotting times for the second dilution. The second dilution, 1 in 20. Where do we plot this? The first dilution 1 in 10. The second dilution 1 in 20. So the concentration in the second dilution is 10 over 20, 50% of the standard. It's 10 over 20 times 100, 50%. So we go along the bottom, 100, 90, 80, 70, 60, 50%. So the 1 in 20 dilutions will be plotted in this area. So for the standard, 1 in 20 dilution, 69 seconds, 70 seconds. Very close. Take an average, 69.5. 1 in 20 dilution, 50% line, 60, 2, 4, 6, 8, 69.5. Of course, it's very just beneath the 70. Third dilution of standard, 1 in 40. What's the concentration relative to the first dilution? 10 over 40 times 100, 25%, 50%, 40%, 30%, 20. How many gradations between 20 and 30? There are 10. 20, 21, 22, 23, 24, 25%, 1 in 40 dilution. clotting times for the standard. These were the two, if you recall, a little different. 85, 78.5. They're a little different. So at this point, we have to ask the question, is one affected by some pipetting error, by a technical error during the test? So I want to look at both of those times to see where they sit on the graph paper. This is the 1 in 40 dilution, 25%. 78.5 seconds. So 70, 72, 74, 76, 78.5 could be here. On the other hand, the other 1 in 40 clotting time, 85 seconds. 80, 82, 84, 85. So we have a decision to make. And for this we now need to look, is there a straight line relationship? And that's where we need the ruler. So when this plot is made manually in this way, on graph paper, this is done visually. Of course, on an autoanalyzer, this is done automatically by the software, and on most autoanalyzers there are assessments of linearity, and this is a useful measure, and there's an advantage to run such assays for that reason on autoanalyzers. Nevertheless, the technique that we've used is precise enough for patient management purposes and can be used. So we need to see, do we have a straight line relationship? And it's immediately apparent that there is a very good straight line relationship, at least if we use the clotting time of 78.5 and ignore the 85. It seems as though this is an outlier. If we put the line of best fit using the ruler and through those points, is it a straight line relationship? Yes. Is every point exactly on the line? No, it's not, and that's typical of this type of assay. I think there's an error in the 85 seconds. 5 of the 6 clotting times taken together form a good straight line relationship. I think that's sufficient. If these were patient samples for patient management purposes, I would be at this stage saying I think it's safe to proceed to make calculations next on the IQC material. So I think the error, whatever it is, has occurred with the 85 seconds. We've met the first criteria. The standard gives a straight line relationship. Now we have to ask the question next, what about the IQC sample? 1 in 10 dilution, which we're treating as 100%. So this is plotted on the same line as the 1 in 10 dilution of standard, of course. Clotting time, 67 seconds. 60, 62, 64, 66, 67 seconds. 1 in 20 dilution. Again, plotted in the same line. 10 over 20 times 100, 50%, 50% line. 73.4 seconds, just under the 74-second gradation. 1 in 40 dilution, IQC sample, 86 seconds. So 1 in 40 in the same plane, 86 seconds,